So we're going to talk about fiber in this lecture, and this will, I don't know, probably 45 minutes or an hour, I would say. And I think one of the interesting things to think about in terms of fiber is, we hear a lot about it and we hear how it's important for us to consume it. But one of the questions is it essential? Does a person have to eat fiber? And we think about what essential is, do we something that our body needs, but we don't make it or make it in adequate amounts. It's kind of what we think about an essential nutrient. So one of the interesting things about fiber is it is not absolutely essential. It doesn't fit the strict definition of something that's essential. In other words, we can live without fiber. For example, even though it's considered important, there are populations in the world that typically don't consume fiber in their diet, or at least they didn't used to, and they were still able to survive. So if you think about populations like certain Inuit or Eskimo populations in the Arctic regions, or some of the tribes in Africa, like I think it's the Maasai tribe in Eastern Africa, no fiber. And how is that possible? Well, their diets didn't include plants. They would eat strictly animal products, and they had no fiber, but they were still able to survive. So, is fiber healthy to consume, though? Absolutely. So it is beneficial, but not absolutely essential. And one of the interesting things about fiber when we look at it is it's not necessarily the fact that fiber is absorbed, because most of it is not. It's the fact that it's not absorbed by us that makes it healthy and and gives it its benefits. So it's the fact that it's not incorporated in the body, it's instead undigestible. And that means that a lot of the fiber stays in the GI for the duration. In other words, it goes all the way through the GI. And in some cases, it's fermented. And we'll talk about fermentation. So how does fiber elicit its effects on the body? And we've heard a lot about the microbiome and how all the bacteria in our gut are really important. So that ties into all of this. And I think that's an area of research now that's up and coming, and it's got quite a bit of interest now, and I think it should. And I think in the US we've been behind other countries. Like I know Japan and some of the other countries have been doing very interesting work in relation to dietary fiber for years. And yet now I think for us we're kind of catching up, and especially the microbiome has really added a lot of evidence to the importance of fiber. So we're going to talk about that. So there's a few ways that fiber actually causes or elicits its effects in the body. One is through gel formation. I think we've all heard the terms, is it water soluble or insoluble fiber? And that definition is very simple. If a fiber is water soluble, when that fiber is placed in an aqueous environment, it reacts with the water, and it changes the consistency of that environment. The most typical significant change is water-soluble fiber tends to form a gel, and that gel has effects on the GI tract. Some fiber, and this is soluble and insoluble, actually directly binds to molecules in the gut, and that's how that fiber causes an effect in the body. But some fibers actually fermented or metabolized by GI bacteria. And that's one of the reasons fiber is so important, is it's actually a nutrient or a fuel source for these bacteria, but not us. So we can consume fiber, we don't absorb it, so it makes it to the bacteria in the lower part of our gut. And that's an important concept that we'll talk about. So let's start talking about, now let me give you the definition of dietary fiber. So you want to know this definition. It is plant polysaccharides and lignin, and you'll see how to spell that in a minute, but it's Lignin. So it's plant polysaccharides and lignin, which are resistant to hydrolysis by the digestive enzymes of humans. There's another term here I want you to know, and that's functional fiber. A functional fiber are non-digestible carbohydrates that have been isolated, extracted, or manufactured and have been shown to have beneficial physiological effects in humans. So you might have heard that term before, but essentially functional fibers can be added to other food products for their benefits. Okay, so we'll talk about where fiber comes from in a second, but let's talk about fermentation of fiber. There's a couple diagrams coming up that kind of show visuals of this, but here's the description. Bacteria in the large intestine. Remember, humans have most of our bacteria in the large intestine rather than the small intestine or the stomach. So we're going to talk mostly about the large intestine. These bacteria secrete and also have extracellular hydrolases that are attached that break down some fibers to monosaccharides, right? So these are typically enzymes or hydrolases that we don't have, but the bacteria do, and that allows them to actually break down fibers. They break it down into monosaccharides that they then absorb, and then they ferment the monosaccharides to either lactate or short-chain fatty acids. And there's a diagram coming up. The lactate and short-chain fatty acids can affect the environment of the large intestine, and the short-chain fatty acids can also be absorbed by colon cells, and they have effects. So let's look at a couple diagrams. I'll give you a second to just sit in awe of my wonderful artistic ability. You can see the circle here is representing a bacterium, and this bacterium has on its surface a hydrolase that's able to hydrolyze the fiber into monosaccharides. So we know from the definition that not all fiber are carbohydrates, but a lot of them, I'd say most of them are, and we don't hydrolyze the fiber into monosaccharides, but these bacteria can. The monosaccharide is then absorbed and it is fermented. And fermentation is the metabolism of a carbohydrate under anaerobic conditions. So these bacteria don't have a source of oxygen. They're not exposed to our blood that's transporting oxygen through our tissues. So these bacteria mostly rely almost exclusively on anaerobic metabolism. Okay, so they ferment the monosaccharides into pyruvate, and then that can be converted to lactate or short-chain fatty acids. And you can see it's a series of steps that I haven't included. The lactate can then be purged by the bacteria, and they would enter the environment around the bacteria. So this would be in the lumen of the gut. And that lactate can decrease the pH of the lumen of the large intestine. And in general, that's a good thing. Decreasing that pH helps things like minerals to be absorbed, and it's a protective, I guess, effect, I'd say, that drop in pH. Short-chain fatty acids, we'll look at in more detail in a second, but they're fatty acids, so they also drop the pH of the lumen of the large intestine. But a lot of these short-chain fatty acids are absorbed by colon cells. So they're actually absorbed into our cells. So this is the first example of bacteria that are actually making molecules that are absorbed by us. A lot of those molecules that are absorbed by us from the gut can actually move through our body to other tissues. And so that's an example of how these bacteria in our gut actually affect other cells in our body. And it can have a significant effect. Lots of data have indicated that. In fact, there are more bacteria cells in our gut than we have our own cells throughout our entire body. So they kind of have us outnumbered. So it's important that we use things like probiotics and prebiotics to establish healthy populations of bacteria, and then to provide them with fuels that allow them to grow and give us healthy benefits. So that's the point of all of this. I'm just going to give you some of the principles behind fiber, though, as we go through this lecture. So let's take a step kind of outward and talk about this. So upper left, so this is all the intestine. Upper left would be small intestine, and these little circles represent bacteria, and the little squiggly blue lines represent fiber. So this fiber has gone through the stomach, has now entered the small intestine, and it's interacting with these bacteria. Now humans tend to have a lot more bacteria in our large intestine relative to our small intestine. So we have a lot more bacteria here. Some of the fibers actually starts breaking down in the small intestine. Some of the fiber forms a gel in the small intestine. But some of the fiber makes it through the small intestine into the large intestine. And that fiber then interacts with all the bacteria in the large intestine and can be metabolized and do things like cause short-chain fatty acids to be made, and then the short-chain fatty acids are absorbed into the colon cells. So this would be that epithelial layer of cells along the walls of the intestine that can absorb things like short-chain fatty acids. And then remember, if molecules go through these cells that line the mucosa of the small intestine, they can get into the bloodstream. So these short-chain fatty acids can actually get into the bloodstream and travel to other tissues. Some of the short-chain fatty acids have effects within the colon cells themselves. Okay, so here's more short-chain fatty acids that are being made when this bacterium is actually hydrolyzing some of the monosaccharides and generating short-chain fatty acids. So an important point of this is the short-chain fatty acids are made from anaerobic metabolism. Okay? And if we look through this, one thing to keep in mind is that anaerobic metabolism or fermentation is almost exclusively for soluble fibers. Insoluble fibers don't tend to be hydrolyzed, and they won't be fermented. So that's a big difference of this. So when we talk about fermentation, we're mostly talking about soluble fiber. So keep that in mind. That also means that soluble fiber forms a gel. It's more likely to be metabolized and broken down as it goes through the gut compared to insoluble fiber. So insoluble fiber is really valuable because it stays intact. It's not metabolized. It basically goes all the way through the gut. One of the most important things that insoluble fiber does is it gives the fecal material volume. So it increases the size of the fecal material, and that tends to have benefits as well. Okay? So those are the diagrams. Let's look at details. So now we're kind of looking at the details of these short-chain fatty acids that can be made. So we have fiber that's fermented. Remember, this is soluble fiber. It can either yield lactate over here, or it can generate these 3 fatty acids. This represents the 4C is 4 carbon, 3 carbon, 2 carbon fatty acids. So they are short chain, because they have small numbers of carbons, fatty acids. So let's look at the first one here. This is butyrate. Now butyrate, once it's made, tends to enter into the colon cells, and it's used as an energy source. So they can take that fatty acid and get ATP from it. And that's very common. It's a very significant energy source for them. So think about what's happening now. The bacteria are using fiber. They're getting energy through fermentation. They are secreting short-chain fatty acids that we get energy from. So that's beneficial. Another really interesting thing about butyrate is it may slow the progression of colon cancer cells. In other words, if you have cells that are exposed to a carcinogen, a molecule that may increase the likelihood of a cell becoming carcinogenic, if you pre-expose those cells to butyrate, butyrate tends to protect those cells from becoming cancer cells. So here's an example of how fermentation of fiber may decrease the risk of things like colon cancer. Okay, so very important point for butyrate. So for propionic acid, we can also refer to that as propionate. That's also made during this fermentation process. The propionate tends to be absorbed by colon cells and then go through the colon cells into the blood. Propionic acid can be used by liver cells as an energy source. Some studies have also indicated that propionic acid in the liver may inhibit cholesterol synthesis by inhibiting the key regulatory enzyme known as HMG-CoA reductase. And I have that on a slide coming up. So now, if you've ever heard that like fiber may decrease the risk of heart disease, this is a potential mechanism, because propionic acid made by bacteria may come through colon cells, go into the liver, and decrease cholesterol synthesis. And that could decrease blood cholesterol levels and the risk of cardiovascular disease. The last one here is acetate. Acetate, I have a star by it because it tends to be the highest short-chain fatty acid in concentration of these three. So it tends to be the most significant. Acetate mostly goes through the colon cells, goes through the liver, and then it's used by skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle for energy. And the cells just absorb the acetate, add coenzyme A to it, and it's acetyl-CoA. So it tends to be a more significant energy source. So one of the questions is, does fiber provide calories? And the answer is yes, it does a little bit. We typically don't count it, but it is contributing some energy to us in general. So let's talk about where fiber comes from. Now we talked about those populations that don't have fiber in their diet because they don't have plants. And this is a schematic representation of the cell wall of an onion, for example. And this shows that cellulose and hemicellulose are arranged into at least 3 layers in a matrix of pectin polymers. So cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin are obviously fibers. Plants are different than us, that they have a cell membrane, but they also have a plant cell wall, and they use that wall to obtain rigidity. They don't have skeletal structures or exoskeletons, so they tend to use that cell wall for their overall strength and their structure. So you can see this primary wall. So here's the cell wall that is basically a mixture of different fibers to give it the type of integrity that's required. So when we eat plants, we eat the plant cell wall and we obtain that fiber. So it's estimated that about 95% of dietary fiber is in the plant cell wall. And remember, plants are the only sources of fiber in our diet, unless there's a functional fiber added. But remember, animal products, no fiber. Plant products have the fiber. So here's an example, though, that we want to keep in mind, and that is that dietary sources of fiber tend to be a mixture of different fibers. So if, for example, we talk about an apple, and the fleshy part of the apple has a lot of pectin, that's a soluble fiber. The outside of the apple, the peel, and this could be a pear or other types of fruits, but the out of that peel has cellulose, and that's an insoluble fiber. So when you eat this, you get both insoluble and soluble fiber. So when we talk about the effects of soluble and insoluble fibers, we're going to talk about them separately, but remember they could be occurring simultaneously from the same food source. The bottom diagram shows, for example, a kernel of wheat or other grain. Remember, the outside part of it is called the husk, and that's the outermost portion. It is basically inedible most of the time. So most of the time that husk is removed. The next layer in, let's get my cursor, is the bran. And the bran is the protective coating around the kernel of grain. And it is rich in nutrients and fiber. So most of a seed or kernel's fiber is in the bran. The next layer is the endosperm, and the endosperm is mostly starch and proteins. So it's not very nutrient dense. The bran has tons of nutrients, for example, and lots of fiber, but the endosperm is just mostly protein and starch. And then the innermost part down here is the germ, and that's the part of the seed that grows into the plant. So it's very rich in vitamins and minerals, and it also has fiber, but tons of vitamins and nutrients in the germ and the bran as compared to the other parts of it. Now, when a person buys a refined grain, it's typically just the endosperm. So it's important that we look for the whole wheat or the whole grain in that. Now, in general, we want probably, half of our carbohydrate to come from whole grains. So it's important that we realize that we look for those in our food source. I think one of the main reasons, lots of nutrients, including fiber, are in there. So the whole grain products have a lot of the germ, the bran, and the endosperm. But they typically have their husk removed, but they're still considered to be a whole grain. Sometimes you can actually buy the husk, like it's like a common fiber supplement is psyllium husk from a specific plant, and it is a very significant source of fiber. It can be, and we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. Okay, so let's talk about the specific types of fiber. We're going to talk about 6 of them, and your textbook has a lot more, but just focus on these. And what do they have in common? Well, they're all different types of fiber. So they are not hydrolyzed by human enzymes. What makes them different? Boy, they're chemical subunits. So their subunits and chemical bonds are different, but they all fall into the category of fiber. So let's look at these, because their makeup kind of determines, and their structure determines, their overall effects in the body. So here's cellulose. I'm going to give you a few details on these different sources of fiber, but I'm not going to make you draw one of these, but you want to understand, you need to remember the details I'm going to give you. So cellulose it's considered to be the most abundant organic molecule in nature. So it's very, very common. And it is all glucose. It's a long linear glucose-only polymer. And remember, it's linked beta-1 to 4. It's very important for cell structure. It tends to form these kind of long molecules that wrap around each other. So even though it's all glucose, cellulose is insoluble because it's large, it's linear, and it doesn't interact well with water. Right? It is poorly fermented. So it's not considered to be a fermented fiber. So its effects are due to its insoluble properties. Hemicellulose, as the name implies, is not a homopolymer. It's heterogeneous mixture of polysaccharides. So there's different parts to it. Hemicellulose tends to have a backbone, kind of a backbone strand that's commonly made up of xylose, mannose, and galactose, so all monosaccharides that are linked together. But it has different side chains, like it has arabinose and the glucuronic acid and galactose. It's also found in the cell wall. Most of these are. But it is, because it's a mixture of polysaccharides, it's can be both soluble and insoluble. So some of it's fermented, some of it is not. So it kind of goes into both categories. Pectin, one of the more common ones. You probably all heard of pectin in things like jellies and jams and other foods. And it's used in those products to control the water in the product. So you can actually affect the physical properties of that. It binds water very well, so obviously that's a good indication it is a soluble fiber. And it's very common naturally as well. Plants use it to control water movement. So it's also heterogeneous, but D-galactouronic acid is a main component, but it is a mixture, and it is highly fermented and water soluble, as I mentioned. And the next one is lignin. And if you look at its structure, remember the definition of fiber is plant polysaccharides and lignin. So lignin is not a carbohydrate. And if you look at it, these are phenol rings throughout lignin. And I think you'll remember from your other chemistry classes, that typically means hydrophobic. So lignin is insoluble. It's not fermented. But it is a significant source of fiber in our diet. And you can find it in quite a few different plant products. It tends to be in the tough or the wood-like portions of plants and seeds, and things like carrots, and some like seeds of strawberries and things like that. You'll find lignin in there. So it is a very important source of fiber, and it's a relatively abundant source of fiber in our diet. 2 more, beta-glucans is the top one. And beta-glucans are very common in things like oat products. And they are homopolymers of glucose. And the glucose is bound by either, you can see here, here's a beta-1 to 4. And this one's a little bit not drawn very well, but this is actually a beta-1 to 3. So beta-glucans are almost exclusively beta-1 to 4, beta-1 to 3. And it's all glucose. It's water soluble. It's found in high amounts in cereal brands, especially oats, but also barley. And it's often used as a functional fiber, and it is highly fermented. And the last one is resistant starches. I think we all know that starches are not fiber unless they're modified in some way. So some starches are modified either through food processing, sometimes it's just temperature changes can cause starches to become resistant. And sometimes it's an actual chemical modification done by a company that causes the starch to become resistant. When we say resistant, what that means is these are starches that are resistant to the hydrolysis of pancreatic alpha amylase. So they're not digested by that enzyme, so they become available for the bacteria, which can ferment them in generally very well. So resistant starches are fibers, but they are highly fermented by bacteria, and they're considered to be water soluble. So let me give you some generic sources of these. We're going to say this. So if I ask you on a quiz or an exam to list or tell me some sources of insoluble fiber in the diet, you can say bran, you can say fruit peels, and vegetables. For soluble fibers from the diet, let's say oatmeal. I think since we're all nutrition people, we mostly have oatmeal for breakfast, right? Oatmeal, we're going to say beans, fruits, and vegetables. So vegetables have both. So those are just dietary sources. All right, and then in general, remember if we look at this diagram, we see the different types of fiber. We see soluble over here, remember they interact with water. Soluble fibers are more fermentable than insoluble fibers. So we talked about all these gums. You can cross off gums, things like gum arabic, and there's different types. Commonly added to foods to affect food properties, but also in the diet. And then over here, the insoluble. Lignin, cellulose, and some hemicelluloses. And we see that over here in soluble, some hemicelluloses are there. It depends on the chemical composition of those hemicelluloses. All right, so let's now look at the general benefits of fiber intake. And these are some of the things that if I ask you, why do we consume fiber? How does it help us? You might come up with these. You might say, oh, we know it reduces constipation, for example. It helps keep keep us regular, if we say, and its complications. We'll look at that. We know it may protect us from heart disease, and one of the mechanisms is it may reduce serum cholesterol. Some studies indicate that it lowers the incidence of colon cancer. I'd say there's probably enough data there to say, yeah, fiber, it's good to increase fiber because it is protective against colon cancer. And then some studies have indicated that it may reduce diverticulosis. We'll look at that in a second. And it may help in weight control. And the top one is fiber can improve the regulation of blood glucose and insulin. So we'll talk about that effect in a second. So you want to be able to describe the mechanisms responsible for each of the above benefits. So we're going to go through and these are generalized. We're going to look at the details essentially of how fiber works to cause some of these benefits. Let's talk about diverticulosis first. You've probably heard that term before. There's diverticulosis and there's also diverticulitis. The diverticulitis is when inflammation is present in a person with diverticulosis. And so let's talk about that. And is it common? It's very common. Diverticulosis is very common. A lot of people have diverticulosis, but they don't ever get diverticulitis. Diverticulitis tends to come in bouts that are different in frequency between individuals. But let's look at this structure of the colon. So we talked about the common structures throughout the intestines and the GI tract. And for example, if we look at this, we have the lumen of the colon, and we have the mucosal layer. Then we have connective tissue, so the submucosa. Here's muscularis externa, so this represents muscular tissue. This is muscular tissue kind of going the other way, kind of at us, I guess you'd say. And then we have, this is a vein that's actually an artery that is providing nutrients to this mucosal layer, but also obtaining nutrients from this mucosal layer. So there are actually gaps in between the muscle fibers in order for vasculature to kind of enter and exit in that tissue. Remember, these cells, these mucosal cells, need oxygen in addition to nutrients. So that's what it normally looks like. Now, what tends to happen is this musculature and connective tissue can have wider and wider gaps. And that can cause kind of a weak point in the structure of that tissue. And what can happen is this tissue, this structure of tissue, can now kind of descend in between those gaps and form an opening or a pouch. And that's what's formed here. These pouches in the colon are called diverticulum. This is a diverticulum. And if you have multiple, you have diverticuli. And if you have those pouches, you have diverticulosis. So the theories on how this is caused. So for a long time, it used to be that it was thought, the major hypothesis was that these gaps formed because of a low fiber diet. And the reason they thought that was because if a person is going to move fecal material through the lumen of the colon, if that fecal material is smaller and more dense in size, that person has to exert more physical force in order to expel that fecal material. The more force that a person is trying to apply, that increases what they call intraluminal pressure. The more pressure that's required increases the likelihood of this. So they thought, well, if you have more fiber, you have more fecal content, less pressure is required to move the fecal material, so it's less likely that these diverticuli are going to form. And so they thought, well, it's related to low fiber intake. Inverse relationship. If you have low fiber, you have increased risk of diverticulosis. A few years ago, the NIH kind of went back through the data and they said, well, we're not convinced when you look at all the data that that's the cause and effect. So they floated another hypothesis that was basically the collagen structure hypothesis, where they said, you know, there's probably a genetic link between a person's collagen genes, the structure of this connective tissue, and the likelihood that a person's going to get diverticulosis. So that's one of the leading hypotheses now. You know, and if you think about it, could be a combination. We have genetic susceptibility, and it could be a combination of low fiber and genetic susceptibility that cause this. But one of the main points of this is not exactly sure what causes it, but we know it's very common. And for example, the prevalence in the United States, let's see here. Sorry. In the U.S., about 10% of the population over 40 years of age has diverticulosis. About 50% of the U.S. population over 60 years of age has diverticulosis. So more than half of the people 60 years of age have diverticulosis. It's very, very common. Do we eat enough fiber in the U.S.? Absolutely not. In general, we're not close to eating enough, or what's recommended. So again, that could be something else that makes us more susceptible to it. But it's very, very common. And again, a lot of people have diverticulosis they don't know. It's not easily identified or characterized. It basically, sometimes it'll take a colonoscopy or high-resolution imaging in order to determine it. You can't determine it with x-rays typically and things like that, so it's not easily diagnosed. But some people that have diverticulosis develop diverticulitis. And again, that's kind of depends on the individual and what they're eating and whether or not they'll get it. But when a person has a bout of diverticulitis, it can be very painful. So the treatment for diverticulitis tends to be, I think I have this here. So for example, when these pouches become inflamed, some of them can actually rupture. And that's when it gets really problematic, because if that tissue ruptures, if you think about it, that person's blood supply is now exposed to all that bacteria in the gut. So you have to be very careful with that. And one of the treatments has traditionally been significant antibiotic treatment. That's kind of being rethought, but that's one of the typical treatments of this. Now, a lot of times that they can become inflamed but not rupture. If they're inflamed, they have diverticulitis, and it can become very painful depending on the individual. Sometimes it's just abdominal kind of discomfort. Sometimes they run a bit of a fever. So there's a variety of symptoms that may or may not realize, that person may or may not realize those symptoms are due to diverticulitis. So the treatment for diverticulitis tends to also include a clear liquid diet. So basically no fiber. They wait till the diverticulitis goes away. And then in general, if a person has diverticulosis, they are on a high fiber diet. And that tends to help decrease the bouts of diverticulitis in general. Okay, so it's very common. People that have it vary in the frequency of their diverticulitis bouts. So let's now look at some of the specifics of how the fiber causes some of these effects. Let's talk about weight maintenance, because that's one of the potential benefits of a high fiber diet. Well, one of the advantages of consuming soluble fiber is it forms that gel. And that gel in the stomach can slow gastric emptying. So imagine if you had a tube of water and then you took, for example, psyllium husk, a very water-soluble fiber, and you poured some of that in there, and then you mix that tube up and let's say you invert it over and over again. And I used to do this as an example, but that water can become so thick, it's just a gel. And that can increase the stomach distension, and that can cause a satiety effect. So basically, we kind of are more full longer because of that. One of the things that does is that gel kind of slows gastric emptying, meaning that if glucose is in that food, the glucose is absorbed more slowly. So you have less of a dramatic increase in blood glucose. Because you have less of a dramatic increase in blood glucose, less insulin is secreted. With less insulin, you have less of a drop or dip in blood glucose, which is often a cue for appetite. So you moderate the glucose, which moderates the insulin, which moderates the appetite cue. And so that can control blood glucose. And in general, it's healthier for us to consume a diet that moderates blood glucose rather than causing big significant increases and decreases in blood glucose. I think those are the main points there. There's also evidence that it decreases risk of colon diseases, and there's two of them here. So if I ask you this, colon disease, you're going to say it may decrease the risk of diverticulosis, and it may decrease the risk of colon cancer. The way that it may decrease the risk of diverticulosis is the high fiber may decrease the risk of diverticulosis by providing fecal bulk. And because of that, it may reduce the risk of diverticulosis. For colon cancer, there's three mechanisms of how it might work. The decrease in pH from the fermentation of fiber. So we talked about diverticulosis, the most important type of fiber tends to be insoluble fiber. For colon cancer, the first one, for decreasing the pH, the most important fiber tends to be soluble fiber because it's fermented. And the lactate and short-chain fatty acids decrease the pH in the lumen of the large intestine. And the reason that's important is because that can decrease the production of secondary bile acids, which tend to be harmful. They tend to promote tumors in the colon, the secondary bile acids. That drop in pH decreases bacterial 7-alpha dehydroxylase activity. The difference between primary and secondary bile acids can be the removal of hydroxyl groups. The bacteria make an enzyme that removes hydroxyl groups. If you decrease the activity of the bacterial enzyme 7-alpha dehydroxylase, you decrease the risk of making secondary bile acids. That tends to decrease the risk of colon cancer, because those secondary bile acids tend to increase, they tend to be carcinogens to colon cells. Okay? And that's through a molecular mechanism that mostly involves gene expression where they're actually working. We won't go into that much detail, but and the second thing for colon cancer is the fermentation and production of butyrate tends to decrease the proliferation of colon cancer cells. We talked about that. And the third one is the fecal bulk dilutes carcinogens and decreases the time they're exposed to colon cells. In other words, if a person consumes carcinogens, which can be part of our diet, part of our normal food supply, some molecules tend to be carcinogenic. The more bulk that's in that feces, you actually dilute the carcinogenic molecules. So this one is mostly about insoluble fiber, because it increases the bulk, and that bulk also decreases the time they're exposed to the colon cells. In other words, the more fecal volume, the more likely it is to move quickly through the colon. Okay, so that's colon diseases. Let's talk about how they can reduce the risk of blood cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. Well, some fibers, and this can be soluble and insoluble, bind to bile acids in the gut and decrease their recycling. Remember, for reducing the recycling of the bile acids, the liver is now taking a new cholesterol molecule. Rather than secreting it into the blood, the liver takes that cholesterol, converts it to a bile acid to replace the one that was not recycled. So that tends to decrease blood cholesterol. Some fibers actually bind directly to cholesterol, and that can decrease its absorption. So we have decreased cholesterol absorption into the blood. The fermentation of fiber can increase short-chain fatty acid production, specifically propionic acid. And propionic acid may decrease liver cholesterol synthesis. And here's the pathway down here. The liver takes acetyl-CoA, goes through multiple steps, 26 steps. I've skipped a lot of them. Goes through all these steps, gets to a molecule called HMG-CoA. HMG-CoA is reduced to mevalonate by HMG-CoA reductase. And then mevalonate eventually becomes cholesterol. So this is how a liver cell makes cholesterol from acetyl-CoA. Propionic acid tends to decrease HMG-CoA reductase. Animal studies have indicated that. And this is the rate-limiting step in cholesterol synthesis. So if we control this enzyme's activity, we can significantly affect cholesterol synthesis. And the last one here is soluble fibers and gel formation can reduce blood glucose absorption or slow blood glucose changes, slow or decrease insulin's effects, and thereby they can reduce insulin stimulation of cholesterol synthesis because insulin stimulates HMG-CoA reductase. So if gel is formed from soluble fiber in the gut, we decrease the blood glucose response, decrease the insulin response, and avoid insulin stimulating HMG-CoA reductase and cholesterol synthesis in the liver. Got it? I think that covers those details on kind of how each of the mechanisms are responsible for the positive effects of fiber. So the recommended intake of fiber. Well, in 2002, an AI, remember an AI is not an RDA, an AI is based on scientific judgment rather than a huge amount of data. But the scientists that are experts in fiber said, well, we think the adequate intake of fiber for men ages 19 to 50 should be 38 grams. And for women, the AI is 25 grams. And a couple of reasons, it's kind of proportional to calories and how much food a person consumes, and also the overall physical size are different. So men need quite a bit more than women. Now and this number's from a few years ago, but the average daily intake of fiber in the U.S. is about 13 and 17 grams a day for men and women respectively. Well below the recommended amount. Okay, so we're still not there yet, but we do need to eat a lot more fiber in the U.S. in general. So just basic recommendations: increase fiber intake, increase the consumption of legumes. That's something that is very low in the U.S. a lot of times relative to other countries. And we should consume at least 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. That's a combination of the different fibers, right? A lot of people don't consume enough of that, especially vegetables. And they consume at least half of the grains per day as whole grains, as recommended by dietary guidelines. Each of those are just general recommendations that unfortunately most people don't meet. Is it difficult to get enough fiber? Well, it depends on food selection. If we go through and we say, well, let's say there's a sample menu of a person and their orange juice, they have a cup of that, and that's 28 grams of carbohydrate, half a gram of fiber, and Wheaties. So I put Wheaties in here. I think I'm probably the only person in San Luis Obispo to eat Wheaties. But let's say we had 3/4 cup of Wheaties, which is not enough. But anyway, 2 grams of fiber there. We have whole wheat toast, ham. Of course, that's an animal product. No fiber there. Again, let's say for lunch we have a sandwich. It's a ham sandwich, got the whole wheat bread, lettuce, and we have beans. If we look at all these food sources here, that's 25 grams of fiber and only 200 grams of carbohydrate. So I'd say overall that's not a lot of food, but good food choices in order to get 25 grams of fiber with just 200 grams of carbohydrate. So it's not that difficult, but unfortunately a lot of people's diets don't look exactly like this. I think we're done there. If we go back to this, I just want to tell you that this is in the handout. Some of these details here on the effects of fiber, there's a handout that's posted on Polylearn. And I think that's it. So I'm going to wrap up here and stop recording, and then I will post this. Thank you.